So the post-classical period, we're going to start with Roman numeral 1, connecting the world. There's a period break here around 1450. That's the start of period 4, because at 1450 Europe is poised to explore the world. So we'll talk about reasons for that, but we're going to be connecting the Eastern and Western hemisphere for the first time in U.S. history, and so that's why there's a period break. World history is going to certainly go through some pretty dramatic changes. So, letter A, European exploration. The purpose of this slide is to talk about all the varied reasons why we see Europeans start to explore. If you remember in period 3, we had jokingly said that they were rolling around in the mud. Europeans are experiencing feudalism. There are, at the end of period 3, some large regional states developing, like England and France. But for the most part, it's a poor part of the world that is continuously fighting amongst themselves. So what is going to make this small part of the world called Europe want to go out and risk their lives and explore the rest of the world? Because most of these explorers will not come back alive. So the first reason for exploration, of course, is wealth. We see on the map that all the way over there in East Asia, that is where all the good things that Europeans want. It's silk and spices and gems, and so all of these things from the Far East is stuff that Europeans want. And if you remember in period 3, Europeans got exposed to this because of the Crusades, and they've never given up the taste for these goods. And so they desperately want to find a more direct route to Asia to get these goods. The problem is that the people who control the route from Europe east to China it has to go through the Italians and the Ottoman Empire. The Italians, if you remember, at the end of period 3, the beginning of period 4, those Italian city-states, Genoa, Pisa, Venice, they're getting very wealthy, controlling the trade in the Mediterranean between Asia and Europe, marking up to as much as 100% the expensive goods that are coming from China. And so the Italians are getting very wealthy, which, remember, of course, leads to the Renaissance. And so, plus the Ottomans are doing the same thing. They're acting as middlemen. And so by the time the goods get from China all the way through South Asia, through Central Asia, into the Ottoman Empire, and then the Italians, the price of these luxury items from Asia has gone way up. It's very expensive. And so the Europeans want to find a way to get to East Asia so they can circumvent all of these middlemen, get it on their own at a much cheaper price. Next reason for exploration is we're going to see that Europeans have a taste for sugar. If you remember, we talked about this in period 3. Europe is too far north to be able to grow sugar, and when the Europeans contacted the rest of Asia in the Crusades, they found out about sugar. They had a taste for sugar, but the problem is that they can't grow sugar. And so what we're going to find out as we go through this lecture today is that the Europeans, as they try to find a way to Asia, they will start to explore some islands, especially off the west coast of Africa, that is far enough south that they can grow sugar. So we'll see sugar be a reason for European exploration. The next thing is we see in the middle of the map Central Asia. For about the 1200s and the 1300s, the Mongolian Empire had established Pax Mongolia. It had created a safe trade route all across Central Asia. And so we see trade goods are going back and forth on the Silk Roads cheaply and quickly. And so Europeans had gotten used to being able to get these goods, even though they're expensive, all the way from China. However, let's go back for a second. However, at the end of period 3, which is another reason we have a period break, the Mongolian Empire is going to fall apart. And when that happens, no more Pax Mongolia. Trade on the Silk Roads will decrease greatly, and so the Europeans are all of a sudden not going to be able to get these goods that they desperately want, even for a high price, because trade across Central Asia is just not happening as much. And so that's another reason we see Europeans motivated to go and explore and get to East Asia to get these goods that have just kind of dried up. Now, the next reason we see these two soldiers in Europe, Europe is normally decentralized, which means we have all these independent European kingdoms, England, France, Spain, the Italian city-states, and they're constantly fighting. And so the way that Europeans view the world is, we can call it compete or die. They're constantly at each other's throats, and we'll see if one European power is able to start to create a link, direct link to Asia, then all the others will want to do that as well. And so if they don't, then they'll die. And so we see the Europeans will be competing against each other to get this better route, to get colonies, to get wealth. And if your neighbor gets it, so do you. And we'll talk about that as a reason for analysis, as, again, one of the things that is pushing the Europeans east. And then we have Christianity. We will talk about in a future set of notes is that Europe is going to go through something called the Protestant Reformation. Before this time, most of Western Europe is one kind of Christian. They are Roman Catholic. But around the early part of 1500, the 16th century, we're going to see that the Roman Catholic Church is going to split. We're going to have Catholics, and then we're going to have this new group of Christians called Protestants. And these Catholics and Protestants hate each other, even though they're both Christian. And this will spur them to go out and explore, because they want to go out and convert the rest of the world to their version of Christianity. And so we'll talk about Catholic countries sending out explorers, sending out priests, and they're trying to convert everybody they come across. And Protestants will do the same thing, although to a little bit lesser extent. So religion is spurring these people to compete to go spread their faith. Next, technological improvements that make exploration possible. Even if you want to go out and explore, as we saw on the last slide, those were all motives for exploration. It doesn't mean you get to. If I want $1 million, that's great, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get $1 million. And so the Europeans, even though they've long wanted to go out and find a direct route to Asia, they haven't been able to because they simply don't have the technology. Well, if we remember from the end of period 3, the Muslim world is going to be exposed to a lot of this maritime technology that eventually the Europeans are going to learn about. And so we see the symbol for Islam on this map because from Muslims, Europeans are going to learn about the stern-mounted rudder. We had talked about that again at the end of period 3. The stern-mounted rudder is a rudder at the back of a ship instead of on the side, as the Europeans used to do. And so if it's on the back of the ship, it gives you more turning radius, which of course is essential if you want to survive some storm at sea. And so we're going to see developments in maritime technology that now will make it possible for Europeans to actually have the ability to go out and explore. The next thing we see, of course, is the caravel. We talked about this last time as well. The caravel has been around in the Indian Ocean since the end of period 2, beginning of period 3, and that's one of those ships that has a lateen sail. Remember, that's a sail that allows you to sail against the wind. Before this time, Europeans could simply not explore much because they could never sail against the wind. They could go out for a certain distance, and then when the wind changed direction, they would be stuck. They couldn't get back to Europe. And so that was something that was limiting Europeans' ability to explore. But now, through contact with Muslims, where the Europeans are going to learn about this triangular lateen sail, or the boat called the caravel that has this, and so now they're going to have the tools to go out and explore. Next, the compass. Now, of course, we had said in previous lectures that the compass was invented in China, which it is, but through trade, the compass is going to move west, and so we're going to see people in the Indian Ocean know about the compass, and then we're going to see people in the Islamic world know about the compass, and then through interactions with Muslims, Christians are going to find out about the compass, and of course that will help maritime trade because it'll help them avoid getting lost, always a positive when you're trying to explore. And then the next thing we have is the astrolabe. The astrolabe, of course, was, if you remember, it was invented by the Greeks, and the astrolabe helps you figure out your north-south position on planet Earth. You just take a measurement of the stars or the sun at noon or at midnight, and that you're able to see how far north or south you are. You put that together with the compass, and you're going to be able to reasonably plot your location on planet Earth. Now, even though the Greeks had invented this, when period 2 ends and the Roman Empire falls, the Europeans lost the knowledge of the astrolabe, but the Muslims did retain that, and so the Europeans will relearn about the astrolabe from the Muslim empires to the east. So before we move on, all of those are things that you could put in an essay to talk about maritime trade technology that makes it possible for Europeans to now start the exploration process. They want to explore, as we saw on number 1, and now they have the ability to explore, as we see on number 2. Next, currents and winds. This is another thing that the Europeans learn about. Just like we saw on the last slide, they learn about some tangible things, things you can touch. Now they're also going to learn about currents and wind, what we call the trade winds, winds that always blow in the same direction. And so your book and AP sometimes refer to these trade winds that always blow in the same direction as volta do mar, which is Portuguese for wind currents or sea currents. And so we see on the map that if you're in the northern hemisphere, if we look in the top left-hand corner, the wind and the currents of the Earth go in a clockwise pattern. They come down from the North Atlantic, they hit the coast of Spain and Portugal, they keep going south to Africa, and then they turn when they get to the equator and then go back west. If you're in the southern hemispheres, we can see on the lower left-hand corner of the map, the wind and the sea currents go in a counterclockwise fashion. You can also see this when you flush your toilet in the northern or southern hemisphere. We see the water draining down a certain way. And so the Europeans are just starting to learn about this. Now, this is going to help them explore, because if you think about one of these wind currents or ocean currents, it's like an expressway on the ocean. If you've ever been to the airport and you get on one of those people movers, all of a sudden you get on one of those and you're zooming through the airport. This is the same thing that we see on the ocean. If you can find one of these currents, you put your boat on this current, and all of a sudden you're going much faster than you would if you were just sitting on the ocean. And now you have the wind behind you making you go twice as fast. And so the Europeans are going to learn how to use these wind currents, volta do mar, or another thing that AP refers to them as is wind wheels. We see these wind currents moving around the planet Earth, and we will talk more about it in future lectures about how they use these to speed up exploration. So the rest of this lecture is going to focus on particular countries as they set out to explore in the correct order. So make sure you understand which European countries are exploring and when. So our first one is the Portuguese. Now, if you remember from your reading and also from the last time period, the first European country that's going to try to go explore the Atlantic are the Portuguese. So let's talk about their motives and methods. On the right-hand side, you see a picture of Prince Henry the Navigator. He is the king of Portugal. It's on the bottom left-hand corner of the map in this little tiny kind of rectangular country. They're very poor. They don't have access to a lot of trade. If you remember, we see these other lines on the map. The Italians are making a ton of money controlling the trade as acting as middleman, and so are the Ottoman Turks. And this poor king, Prince Henry the Navigator, he doesn't like this. He wants to have his own route to Asia. And so he decides that he is going to try to create an academy for map makers and sea captains. And he's going to gather all the latest technology and the latest maps and the latest knowledge of how to sail. And he's going to try to help the Portuguese go out and explore and find their own route to Asia. And so we see that the Portuguese, of course, are part of this just because of geography. The Portuguese are on the Atlantic coast, so it makes sense that they would be great sailors and interested in maritime technology. The next thing is this. AP wants you to know that some governments sponsor exploration, some governments don't. And so Prince Henry the Navigator, this is an example of government-sponsored or state-sponsored exploration. We're going to get to some other countries, for example, England. England's even more poor than Portugal, and the King of England, he's just not going to have enough money to go out and support exploration. It's a very expensive business. But in Portugal's case, Prince Henry the Navigator, he thinks this is his number one priority, and so he's going to start paying for people to go out and explore. And so we see Portugal, which is great positioned here. They want to get their route to Asia, but if we look at this map, it becomes very obvious where they go and why. Now, they can't get from Portugal on the left of the map all the way to China on the right. They can't go from east to west to get to China because that's already controlled by the Italians and the Ottoman Turks. And so they're not going to let him send out explorers because those are powerful, wealthy states, and they're going to kill him anytime he tries to send out explorers if he goes east. So what direction should he go to get to Asia? Well, he can't go north, because if you go north, they know that you're going to run into icebergs, and you just won't be able to get all the way around Asia going north. And we know we can't go west, because most thinking people, most educated people at this time know that the Earth is round. It certainly is possible to get to China by sailing west around the globe, but nobody knows how big the world is. Would you just keep sailing for months and months and months, and then you would die, you would run out of food and water. And so west is not an option for these people. So the only compass direction left that you can go is south. And so we see at the beginning of the 1400s, at the beginning of the 15th century, right at the end of period 3, we see the Portuguese under Prince Henry the Navigator start to send out explorers, and they inch their way along the west coast of Africa. And now they can get as far as what we see on the map, the Azores and the Canary Islands. These are islands off the west coast of Africa, and the Portuguese, quote-unquote, discover these islands, and they're overjoyed, because these islands are close enough to the equator that they can actually grow sugar on these islands. And of course, that is a huge crop that's in demand in Europe, and so the Portuguese instantaneously become wealthy, because now they don't have to go all the way to Asia to find sugar. They can grow their own sugar in the Azores. Now, the other thing that they find out is they, of course, can inch a little bit further along the coast of Africa, and they can get to West Africa. And we know from period 3 that the Muslims were making a ton of money with trans-Saharan trade, going across the Sahara Desert, trading finished goods for places like Ghana and Mali and Songhai Empire, and they were trading finished goods for slaves, gold, and ivory. But now the Portuguese have a better route. They don't have to go across the desert. Even though, yes, it's a little bit longer in mileage, it's still much quicker going on water and less dangerous than going across the Sahara Desert. And so we see the Portuguese be the port of entry into Europe for slaves, gold, and ivory, mostly gold and ivory. And so Portugal is becoming very wealthy. The other thing that we see that Portugal is the first to start is they start engaging in the Atlantic slave trade. They're the first people to do this. They want to grow sugar on the Azores because it's a huge cash crop, but there's not enough Portuguese to do it. It's very dangerous work. Lots of people die doing it, and so the Portuguese need a labor force that they can force into growing the sugar. And so in West Africa, they go along the coast and they trade coastal West African kingdoms. They trade them finished goods for slaves. They then take these slaves to the Azores, and we see the very first instance of African slaves in the Atlantic. So this is a good break for a time period. In period 3, we saw, of course, slavery in Africa, but the slaves were being taken east into the Muslim world in Mesopotamia to grow sugar in what is today Iraq. And we remember the Zanj rebellion from there. But now in period 4, we see slavery now going in a new direction. It's not just going east. Now African slavery is going west into the Atlantic world. So that's a definite change over time. And so we see the start of the Atlantic slave trade, which is how AP refers to it. So now we see number 3, India. So the next thing that these Portuguese want to do, since they've started to make some money by the slave trade and the sugar trade, is they want to find a way to get to China and India. The problem is they don't have a nice map like this. They don't know how far South Africa goes. And so because they have the caravel, because they can now sail against the wind, they can start sailing against the wind and inch their way along the west coast of Africa. Every year they send out another explorer. He goes maybe a couple hundred miles more south. He discovers a new port. He trades. He goes back up to Portugal. And so year after year after year, we start to see the Portuguese start to inch their way around the west coast of Africa. And this is very important because they start to look for ports. And we are going to talk about the Portuguese having a port-based or maritime-based empire, which means they don't control Africa. Even though the Portuguese are starting to go around Africa, they don't go into Africa. They don't create a land empire because there just isn't enough Portuguese, and there's too many Africans to do that. They couldn't conquer them. Plus, the Portuguese don't want Africa. They want to get around Africa. So the only thing they're interested in Africa in, besides the gold, ivory, and slaves, is they want to get ports. Because every so often, every few weeks, you need to resupply your boat with water and food. And so there's just a few locations along the west coast of Africa that is not a nice port that ships can stop and do this. And so they fortify these ports. They control them. And as we will see in the future, if any other European country tries to go along the west coast of Africa, they have no place to stop because the Portuguese control all of these ports already. And so the Portuguese are going to hang on to this as much as they can. Remember, the normal way of thinking in Europe is compete or die, and so the Portuguese are not going to share their ports with any other European country along the way. So that means other countries like Spain or England or France are going to have to look for another way to Asia besides going around Africa. Well, eventually, as the Portuguese start to inch the way around Africa. What they realize is it's taking way too long to get around Africa, because if you remember, Africa is in the southern hemisphere, and so the wind going up the west coast of Africa goes counterclockwise. They're always trying to sail up against the wind. And so the Portuguese think, well, let's use these windmills, let's use these Volta do Mar. And so the Portuguese take a risk. Instead of going around Africa, as you can see on the map, they hang a right when they get to the Azores, and they shoot out across the Atlantic, going in the exact opposite of where they want to be, India. But that's okay, because they know that eventually the wind is going to go in a circle and circle back around Africa, which exactly is what it does. It goes in this counterclockwise motion, and even though it looks like you're going way out of the way, as soon as you get to about 3/4 of the way across the Atlantic, the wind starts to turn and go in this counterclockwise motion, and then it shoots you across the Atlantic Ocean and around the southern tip of Africa and then up to India. And so even though it looks like this is a much longer route, it really takes half the time, because you're on this expressway, you're on this current that we've talked about before. And so the very first Portuguese that goes to India, gets around the coast of Africa and all the way to India, is a guy by the name of Vasco da Gama. You see his name on the bottom. He gets to India, he's very excited, he's like, oh my gosh, we found a route to India, we're going to be rich, think of all the gems and the spices we could bring back to Europe. The problem is when he gets to India, he has nothing that the people in India want. He was planning to sell iron pots and pans to the people of India in exchange for priceless gems and spices, and the Indians just laugh at him like, we don't want your crummy cargo. And so he has to give them the little amount of gold and silver that he brought with him, which is enough to fill some of his hold of his ship with some of these spices. He makes his way back to Portugal, and just even having a portion of his ship full is a king's ransom. It makes him and Portugal really wealthy, and so more and more Portuguese are going to come into the Indian Ocean. Now, we're going to skip ahead a little bit. There's going to be some other exploring that goes on from other countries, but since we're on Portugal, let's go ahead and go into about the 1550s, 1580s, and we'll see one of these Portuguese explorers. He has the man by the name of Amerigo Vespucci with him as a map maker, and they're doing this route where they go way out across the Atlantic before they take a left turn, but this guy doesn't pay attention to his calculations, and he turns south a little bit too late, and he runs into something unexpected. He runs into a new continent, and of course the Portuguese will then lay claim to something they call Brazil. And so even today the people in Brazil speak Portuguese, because this is now a Portuguese colony. So now we have three very powerful empires in Europe. We have the Ottomans, who have a little bit of Eastern Europe. We have the Italian city-states, and of course we have the Portuguese. So all three of those are sources of wealth and power, and of course art. When the Europeans get to the Indian Ocean, they want to create a change. So remember, one of our essays is change over time. So the Portuguese get to the Indian Ocean, and we know in period 3, even going back to period 2, there's been all kinds of merchants in the Indian Ocean using monsoons and some of these technologies that the Europeans have just learned about. There's Chinese, Southeast Asians, Muslims, Indians, Africans trading in peace, more or less, in the Indian Ocean, but that's not the European way. When the Portuguese arrive into the Indian Ocean, they say to everybody in the Indian Ocean, even though it's just a few Portuguese, we are the only ones that can trade here, and if you want to trade, this is our ocean, even though we just arrived, and you have to pay us tribute. Now, there's not a lot of Portuguese, but when they do arrive in the Indian Ocean, wherever the Portuguese do land, they can have their way, because they have something that nobody else in the Indian Ocean has. They have cannons. The Portuguese put cannons on their tiny little ships, and nobody else had thought to do that. They had gunpowder in India and in China and in the Arab world, but they had never thought to put cannons on ships. And so the Portuguese are able to slowly take control of parts of the Indian Ocean. Not all of it, but parts of it. The Portuguese are not content to just share the Indian Ocean, because that's not the European way. It's compete or die. And so when they come into the Indian Ocean, they say, this is ours, mine, and you can't have it. And so we start to see some conflict in the Indian Ocean among the Portuguese and the Swahili and Muslims and Indians and Chinese. More about that later. Next, we talk about no land empire. So in another time period, period 5, we're going to talk about how the Europeans create colonies around the world, even to some extent in period 4, but not the Portuguese. The Portuguese just don't have enough Portuguese. It's a small country. There's not enough white Portuguese to go and create a huge empire in Africa or in India. And so they just have to create these ports. They control little tiny ports, and that's all they really want. As long as you control the port, you can control the maritime trade. So we're going to leave the Portuguese for a little bit. Now we're going to go to the Spanish. The Spanish is letter C, Spanish quest for trade. And just like we do with all of these countries, let's talk about Spanish motives. Why do the Spanish want to go out and risk their fortune and lives to explore? Well, Spain is the country you see in the middle of your map. Portugal is just on the left-hand side within the red lines. And so you remember Portugal is getting very wealthy because it controls this trade around India, it controls this trade around Africa, and the European model is compete or die. And so the king and queen of Spain, they are called King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. What they do is they don't want to have a powerful Portuguese neighbor. They realize that the Portuguese are going to get so powerful and so wealthy that they may conquer Spain, compete or die. And so the Spanish decide that they need to explore. But they haven't before 1492 because the Spanish have been distracted. The Spanish have been busy killing Muslims. If you remember, ever since the Umayyad Empire, the Muslims have come in and controlled most of Spain. So from around 700 to 1492, we're going to see we're going to see Christian Spaniards and Spanish Muslims fighting each other for control of Spain. The Spanish call these Muslims Moors. That's what we call Muslims in Spain. And so for 700 years, they're going to be fighting each other, and slowly but surely, the Spanish Christians push the Moors, push the Muslims south, and gain more and more and more of Spain, and this is called the Reconquista, the reconquering. The warriors themselves are called conquistadors, conquerors. So eventually, in the year 1492, the Spanish are able to push the last Moors out of Gibraltar, out of the southern tip of Spain. And so we see great victory and joyousness in Spain. They're excited they have their own country again. But what is a conquering country to do? This is a warlike society. They've been fighting for 700 years. And so just at that time, we see Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, he comes to the king and queen of Spain, and he says, look, I can give you new lands to conquer, and I can give you what you most want. I can give you the ability to compete with Portugal. And they say, well, how can you do this? And he says that I can give you a route to Asia. And they say, well, how can you do that? The northern route is too cold, the eastern route is controlled by the Italians, and the southern route is controlled by the Portuguese. And we can't go west because, who knows what's out there? Columbus says, I know what's out there. China's out there. India's out there. And he says, give me 3 ships, give me some money, and I can sail west to get east because the earth is round. Well, no, duh, everybody knows the earth is round, but Columbus convinced them that he knows exactly how big the earth is, and he says, if I sail west for 3 weeks, I will reach China. Now, of course, he's wrong. The earth is about twice as big as he thought it was, and so he is not going to discover a new route to Asia. But what he is going to discover, of course, is the Americas. So this is before the Portuguese discover Brazil. I'm just covering these not necessarily chronologically when I talk about Brazil, just because we were on the Portuguese. But in 1492, the same year that they kick out the Moors, the Spanish, through Christopher Columbus, discover the Americas. Now, Christopher Columbus believes he will go to his deathbed believing that he discovered the Indies. If you look at the yellow arrows, Christopher Columbus, when he hits the West Indies, what we call the Caribbean today, he thinks he's really discovered what we look at, if we look at the other yellow arrow on the map, the Philippines, or what there's called the East Indies. And so he is sure that somewhere out there, not too far away, is China. Or is India. He doesn't have a very good map. And so when he meets the people on the islands that come out to greet him in the Caribbean, he mistakenly calls them Indians because he thinks he's near India, or at least China. And so he will do 3 more voyages for a total of 4, constantly looking for China. So, of course, he doesn't find that. There's a big roadblock in the way between Europe and Asia. It's the Americas. And so now we're going to see the Spanish have a large amount of colonies in the New World, and we'll call it New Spain. So we see his exploration and other Spanish explorers who come after him. We'll talk about them. They're Pizarro, Cortez. More people we'll talk about later. But they explore the Caribbean and what is Central America and Western United States today, and of course most of South America that isn't already controlled by the Portuguese. Now, why are the Spanish continuing to go west? They know by Columbus's 4th voyage, they know that this is not Asia. So why keep going? Well, one, they're looking for a way to get around South America. They don't know how big it is. Or around North America. They don't know how big that is either. But the other thing they're drawn by is when Columbus discovered these Indians in the Caribbean, he saw that they were wearing gold and silver jewelry. So he's like, oh my gosh, there must be gold and silver around here. He reports that back to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Remember, they have to compete or die. And so we see Spanish explorer after Spanish explorer not only looking for the fabled Northwest Passage, which is it's a way to get around the Americas to get to China, but they're also looking for more gold and silver. So that's going to attract more and more Spanish to the New World. Finally, we get a Spaniard who finds a passage around the Americas, and his name is Ferdinand Magellan. You see a picture of him in the bottom left-hand corner. He will use the windmill, he will shoot right across the Atlantic, and then he will go inch down along the coast of South America. He will go around the very southern tip of South America, a place called Tierra del Fuego, Land of Fire. And then he will inch up the west coast of South America until he hits the windmill again, and he will shoot across the Pacific. This takes a lot of time. He loses most of his boats and most of his crew. Some of them in mutiny on him. So it's a long, arduous journey. Eventually, after weeks and weeks and weeks of traveling across the Pacific Ocean, he discovers the Philippines. And so from this point on, the Philippines, for a long time, for 400 years, will be controlled by the Spanish, until, of course, the Americans will take it from them. And so Ferdinand Magellan, he gets in trouble. He has a fight with some natives in the Philippines, and he dies there. But then his crew continues around, trading as they go, filling up their boat with spices, and they eventually go all the way back to Spain and circumnavigate the globe. The first people, we think, to do that. And so now we see that truly the world is united, Eastern and Western Hemisphere. We have proven that you can get east by sailing west. It's just a really long way. And so we see the Spanish are going to start to colonize all throughout the world. Now, the Spanish, of course, have not found a route to China, but the Philippines are pretty close. And so there is a town in the Philippines called Manila. Now, the Chinese have been trading with people in Manila for a long time. And so when the Spanish get to the Philippines, Magellan and later Spanish explorers, they're going to start trading with the Chinese at this port of Manila. And so the Spanish are not allowed to trade directly with the Chinese. If you remember from our last set of notes, we talked about how the Ming Dynasty, they ended the treasure fleets and they cut off all trade, all exploration with the outside world. And so only Chinese merchants can go from China to Manila. But that's where the Spanish and the Chinese and the Filipinos and the Southeast Asian all meet. It becomes a very important trading center. And so we're going to see this thing called the Manila trade, or the Manila galleons. And so what the Spanish will do is they will find gold and silver in the New World. They will carry it across the Pacific Ocean, stop in Manila, trade with the Chinese for silk and spices and gems, everything the Europeans want, and then they will either take those holds and they'll give the Chinese gold and silver, and then they'll take their goods either all the way back through the Indian Ocean up the coast of Africa, or sail it all the way east back across the Pacific Ocean and eventually back to Spain. So we see this world trade network developing between the Europeans, the Chinese, the Southeast Asians, and a lot of it is centered here at Manila. Now these boats that take this gold back and forth across the Atlantic, and then they take Chinese luxury goods back and forth across the Pacific, they are called the Manila galleons. A galleon is a type of boat that the Spanish sail. So we'll put the Spanish aside for now. Let's go to the Dutch. The Dutch are going to get about third in the exploration game. The Dutch, you can see on the map there, they're right in the middle, kind of north-central of Europe. And the Dutch, they're a brand new country. In the last part of the 16th century, the 1500s, they're going to fight a war of independence. They were controlled by the Spanish, part of the Spanish Empire, but in the late 16th century, the late 1500s, they're going to declare their independence from Spain, and so now they're this baby country, very nervous that some other European power is going to conquer them, and so the European model is compete or die. So what do the Dutch need to do? They need to find their own route to Asia. They need to find their own colonies, and so the Dutch are going to go out and explore. Problem: the Dutch they're not wealthy. They don't have a rich king to fund exploration like the Spanish and the Portuguese. The Dutch, in fact, don't have a king at all. They have something called a republic. They have elected leaders, and so we're going to see that the Dutch have to finance their exploration in a different way. So what they do is they come up with this idea of a joint stock company. Make sure you understand what this is. It's a very important part of this class. A joint stock company is a way of financing exploration when you don't have a king. And so what they do is the richest men in the Netherlands, which is the Dutch, they join together and each one gives a little bit of his fortune to a company. And what they get in return is a piece of paper that says you own a part of this company, which we call a stock or a share. And so we are seeing the beginnings of modern companies that are controlled by a group of people, and the people who invest in the company and who are part owners are called shareholders or stockholders. And so by pooling their resources, since they don't have a single king rich enough to do it on his own, these Dutch pool their resources, they create these joint stock companies, and then the company sends explorers out. If the explorers come back with gems and spices, all of the shareholders share in the wealth. If the explorers die at sea, which most of them do, then each of the investors is only out a little bit of their fortune, and they can still continue to fund exploration. It's a very novel, new financial idea. So make sure if you ever get an essay on this, something new, a change over time, is that the Dutch come up with a new financial invention, the joint stock company. So let me give you the name of the joint stock company so you can put it on an essay. It's called the VOC, which in Dutch means the Dutch East India Company. Obviously it's in Dutch, so it has different letters to stand for this acronym, but the Dutch East India Company is the VOC, and they're going to be the ones financing all this exploration for the Dutch. So where do the Dutch go? Well, the Portuguese are not going to be able to hold on to their colonies around the west coast of Africa. The Dutch, with this money, this new system of funding exploration, they are going to start sailing around the west coast of Africa, and where they can, they're going to start blowing away the Portuguese ports. A little bit at a time, they're going to pick them away, and so now the Dutch are going to start to have some of the ports along the west coast of Africa. So if we were doing a timeline, the Portuguese control the trade around Africa first, and then the Dutch come about 150 years later and start to begin to control that trade because they have a better way of financing exploration. And so the Dutch will take over control of South Africa. More about that later. We'll see lots of Dutch colonists go down to South Africa. Their descendants are still there today. And so they will control the Cape of Good Hope, which we need to know that is a choke point of trade. It's at the very bottom tip of Africa, and if you control that choke point, that strategic location, you can control people going around Africa, and this is going to make the Dutch very wealthy. It's going to give a monopoly around the trade around Africa. They're also going to start to take ports away from the Portuguese in India. They're also going to start to take ports away from the Spanish in Southeast Asia, where you see a star just south of the Philippines. And so we see the Europeans not just competing and fighting against each other in Europe, they're going to be fighting against each other all around the world to control this very lucrative, very important trade. Also, it is not land-based. We will get to some land-based empires later in this lecture, but not the Dutch, for the same reason as not the Portuguese. The Netherlands is a small, tiny country, and they just don't have the manpower to be able to overwhelm Africa or India or even Indonesia. And so we're going to see them just control ports, not be able to create a land-based empire. So this is a port-based empire. Now, eventually, in period 5, the Europeans will be able to overcome this because they'll invent the machine gun and modern artillery, and so then just a few Europeans can kill a whole bunch of people in the rest of the world, but not yet. So we'll come back to that later. So let's talk about Indonesia. If you look at this map again, it's in the bottom right corner. It's the star. That's the East Indies or Indonesia. And everybody wants to get there. There, India and China, that's the place to be because they have spices. The Europeans are so far north that they just don't have a tropical enough climate to grow spices. And so they don't have pepper. And so if you can imagine eating food that has very little taste, everything's boiled, you can't preserve it, and so it's just this bland food. And so way back in period 3, when the Europeans got in touch with Asia for the first time in the Crusades, they learned about these spices that were coming from Southwest Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. And they said, this is amazing. I can't go back to eating boiled, bland food. And so there was this tremendous demand for spices. What you see in this thing, we see some saffron, we see some cinnamon, we see pepper, we see nutmeg. And so the Europeans want these spices. And if you brought back just one boat boatload, that would make you as rich as maybe the King of England, who's not a rich king, granted, but still a king. And so all of these people are willing to risk their lives to get to Southeast Asia, to get to Indonesia, to bring back a cargo of these spices. Spices equal money. All right. Conquest. And so we're seeing the Europeans in period 4, it's different than period 3, a definite change, because in period 3, again, we said the Europeans are barely surviving. They certainly are fighting each other. In period 4, they're becoming really wealthy, and they're starting their march to world domination. It's starting here in period 4. By period 6, they will dominate the world, but it's starting here in period 4 with their quest for spices. Next, different from Spain. And so let's talk about it, because the Spanish were in Indonesia as well. If you remember, they were in Manila in the Philippines. The Spanish model for conquering Indonesia was to come in and conquer a port and set up a garrison and control that port permanently. Now, they couldn't control all of the Philippines. There's not enough Spanish, but that port. The Dutch, they don't do that. There's not even enough Dutch to control a port in Indonesia on a permanent basis. There's just so few Dutch. And so what the Dutch do is they come in and they will visit the natives and they say, okay, natives in the East Indies, the Philippines, Indonesia, trade with us. And if you don't trade with us, we're going to blow you away. We have cannons. And so they threaten them, and the natives, they give them spices. The Dutch give them something in return, something small, some finished product, and they say, we're going to be back in a year. And we better not find out. We're going to ask around, did you guys trade with any other European power? And when we come back, if we found out that you did trade with another European power, we will kill you and your whole family. And that's how the Dutch try to control Indonesia. The Spanish method is conquer a port and stay there. The Dutch method is come in once a year. It's kind of like creating tribute and threaten the Indonesians not to trade with anybody else. So we see two different methods of dealing with Indonesia, the Spanish method and the Dutch method. So, during the 16th century, that is really the heyday of Dutch power. The Netherlands have a brief period of major power, and it must be sad to be Dutch to some extent today, because their apex of civilization, the time when they ruled the world, was way back in the 1600s. From this point on, the Dutch they're just not going to be enough Dutch to be able to hold on to their colonies and their ports and to be able to hold on to their trade routes. We're going to see other countries start to supplant them just because there's not that many Dutch. And so we go to England. So England's quest for trade. As always, we're going to start with motives and methods. Now, England, you can see on this map, it's the island. It's the pink island. It has Scotland above it. And it is a very, very poor country. It doesn't have a lot of resources. Its people are poor. It's really far north, so you can't grow any cash crops. And so we see that the English, they see their neighbors getting wealthy, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, and they think, oh my gosh, we better send out explorers, or we will die. We have to be able to get our own colonies, our own route to Asia, or else we're not going to be able to keep out invading armies. And so, of course, England is poor. I said that they were one of the poorest kings. And so they follow the Dutch method. Since they don't have a rich king that can sponsor exploration, what they do is they create, just like the Dutch, they copy them, a joint stock company. And so that's how they're going to finance exploration. But really, we won't see the English start to explore and create colonies until about the 1600s. The reason being is that the English are so poor and so broke and so, let's face it, pathetic before 1600, that they just are not a world power, and so they have to find a big brother who will protect them. And that big brother is Catholic Spain. So for many years, the English were the poor little brother that is being protected by Catholic Spain, and so they can't send out explorers because the Spanish, that will tick them off. The Spanish say to England, look, you just be on your little island, we'll protect you as long as you don't try to rival us in the exploration game. And so up until about 1600, the English don't send out explorers. But in 1588, that all changes. Just before 1588, the King of England, he decides, we'll talk more about this in another lecture, but he decides that he wants to start his own faith. He doesn't want to be Catholic anymore. And so that makes him an enemy of very Catholic Spain. And so now England is no longer friends with Spain, and so they decide that they are going to send out explorers, but every time they do, the Spanish just blow them out of the water. The Spanish, by now, having all of this wealth, all of these colonies, all of this gold, they have a huge navy, and so England remains poor. So in 1588, the Spanish decide once and for all, let's get rid of these non-Catholic English, and they are going to invade England. And we see the picture here. It's the Spanish Armada. Hundreds of ships sail from Spain to go conquer England. But just like we saw in period 3, a big storm, when the Mongols are trying to invade Japan, a big storm rises up and sinks the Spanish Armada. And this really marks the high point of Spanish power. From this point on, they will never really recover from losing their fleet. And the English will now be on the rise. They're going to start out being able to send out a couple explorers. They can start creating colonies. And the Spanish really can't stop them because they've lost their fleet. And so after 1588, like I said, around 1600, we're going to see the English start to colonize. So we see these two kings. So the king that wanted to create his own religion that started to have conflict with the Spanish is King Henry VIII. You see him down there, and then his daughter Elizabeth I. They're going to be creating their own religion, and it's going to be a form of Protestantism. If you remember, I talked about on the very first slide, we talked about this is a motive for exploration. Protestants and Catholics, Christians are going to fight each other to spread their faith, to compete, and so we'll talk more about Protestantism and Henry VIII and Elizabeth, but these are the English monarchs that are going to be fighting Spain to go out and go get their new colonies. So let's talk about the Americas. So what we see is once England starts to get their colonies, and the French, and the Spanish, and the Portuguese, this is what the New World, if we want to call it that, looks like, the Western Hemisphere. We can see by far the country that is the most successful colonizing the New World is Spain. The Caribbean is in this yellow colors, Florida, what is today Mexico and southwestern United States, and then most of South America. We do see the Portuguese controlling Brazil. And then we see the French, who we will talk about in a minute. We see the French, they're in green, and they're going to be able to conquer most of the central part of America, North America. And then the English are just kind of left with the little bits. They have a thin strip along the east coast, which will become the 13 colonies, and then a whole bunch of rather worthless land at that point up in England. And so the English are interested in getting colonies to compete with everybody else. But the main thing they're interested in is finding a route to Asia. So they're looking for the fabled Northwest Passage. They send explorers out all over North America. Surely there must be a way to sail through North America, and then China must be right behind it. They don't have a very good map. The other thing they're looking for is gold. If the Spanish found gold in the New World, so can we. So all of these early English explorers are looking for the Northwest Passage, or they're looking for gold. Of course, you'll learn more about this in AP US History next year. Next, as English people are looking for the Northwest Passage and gold, there is going to be a very small group of English people that come for something we haven't talked about before with any European country. They're coming to stay. We see a small number of English colonists. They're not necessarily looking for gold. They're not necessarily looking for the Northwest Passage. They just want to go to the New World because they want religious freedom. We'll talk about these people. They're called the Pilgrims or the Puritans, and they're going to escape England because the English king was killing them for their faith. And so they thought, well, if we can go to the New World, we'll be a long ways away from the king. So in 1620, they sailed to the New World, 1619, 1620, and they set up the first of the English colonies, what will become the 13 colonies. More about that later. What do these religious people come for? Well, they come for religious freedom, but they still need to pay their bills. And so one of the things that they do is they discover that the New World has naval stores. That means they have nice tall trees, they have pitch and tar, they can grow hemp, all of the things you need to supply England with its navy. So they make a little bit of money there. Some of the English who come to the New World, not pilgrims, so not looking for religious freedom, but they are looking to get gold and get rich. They settle in what will be the southern English colonies, Virginia, South Carolina, those places, and they don't find gold, but they do find a cash crop, tobacco. It doesn't make you as much money as sugar, but it certainly is something that you could support your colony on. And so we see the English colonies in the New World. Some come for religious freedom, some come to get rich, but they're going to be there for a while. Next, the English in India. The English are going to also want to get to India. Everybody wants to get to India. So let's go through a change over time. We saw the Portuguese go around Africa to get to India first. Then the Dutch about 100, 150 years later, they're going to be able to supplant the Portuguese. And then finally, around the late 1600s, well into the 1700s now, so we're getting near the end of the time period, the British are starting to control ports in India. They've made some money off of their other colonies, and so we'll see here and there some British ports. but it is not a land-based empire in period 4. There's just not enough British to take over India. Later on they'll do that with machine guns, but not yet. And so in India, in period 4, we're going to see that India is controlled by Indians, Hindus, Muslims. It's going to see Dutch, Portuguese, English, and so there's going to be a lot of people controlling various ports along the Indian coast. And again, what does the English want in India? Gems, cotton especially, and pepper spices. Now, I hesitate to bring this up. I will, although it's not in this time period. What we're going to see is that eventually the English are going to probably spend more time than anybody else exploring the Pacific. So we are now going to go, just make a note in your notes that this is period 5, but in the mid-1700s to the late 1700s, we're going to see Captain James Cook. He is an English explorer, and you see all of his voyages around the Pacific here. He's looking for new lands, new continents to explore, maybe looking for the Northwest Passage, and he looks like he's had a little bit too much grog or rum. He looks drunk. He's just wandering his way around the Pacific, but he will discover Hawaii as well as a whole bunch of other Pacific islands. And so the British will start to get a whole bunch of islands in the Pacific, whether it's in New Zealand or Australia and other places. Now, the British don't take Hawaii because the Hawaiians are too strong, and they actually do kill Captain James Cook when they have a battle. So the Hawaiians will be a rare exception of native peoples keeping their independence, but we will see the British heavily involved in the Pacific Ocean in period 5. Our last group is France. So France, motives and methods for exploration. And it's the same we've talked about for England, Portugal, Spain, and the Dutch. It's this compete or die method. They see everybody else getting colonies, they want colonies too. And so just make sure, I couldn't put England and France together at the same time, but they're both really sending out explorers at the same time. So we see about 1600 on. Now, the French are a little bit different than the English. They are more driven, just like the Spanish, by religion. The French are a Catholic country, and so just like the Spanish, the French will send out priests whenever they go explore. And the Catholic priests that certainly go with most explorers are Jesuit missionaries. We'll talk more about the Jesuits in other lectures, how they get formed, why they're there, but one of the main functions of the Jesuit is to convert people, to spread Catholicism around the world. And so that is going to be one of the primary motives for the French to explore, is to convert people to Catholicism, as well as to get rich, as well as to find the Northwest Passage, and of course to compete with their neighbors. So French exploration, the main thing they're looking for in the New World is to find the Northwest Passage. Really, Spain has taken up a whole bunch of land already. England has some land too. And so the French sail the coast of North America looking for a major river or a harbor. They think that this may be just the Northwest Passage they're looking for. And so they find the St. Lawrence River, which you see up in the top of the map. St. Lawrence River goes all the way into North America. It connects with the Great Lakes. And they think this is the fabled Northwest Passage. If we just sail through these lakes, we'll find the Pacific Ocean. Obviously, that's not the case, but all of that is going to be part of New France. Then the French go further south. They sail around Spanish Florida, and they discover the mouth of the Mississippi. This must be the Northwest Passage. So they sail up the Mississippi River as far as they can, and they find out, no, in fact, it's not the Northwest Passage, but that also is going to be part of New Spain. And so we see this today. Quebec, up in Canada, they speak French. If you go to Louisiana, New Orleans, or Baton Rouge, these are all French places that people still speak French there today, even though it's controlled by the United States or Canada. And so the French are establishing a presence in the Americas as well. Now, the French don't, of course, you can't grow sugar in Canada or in Louisiana, well, or you can in Louisiana, but we'll talk about that later, but certainly not in Kansas or Missouri. It's too far north. And so what are the French to do? They can't get rich growing cash crops like sugar, so why do they even want this new world? Because what you can get rich doing is hunting animals, beaver pelts most specifically. In Europe, there is a huge fashion trend that people want animal pelts. All of the beaver in Europe has been hunted out of existence, and most of the animals. And so only rich people, only nobility can wear beaver pelts or animal furs, and it's a sign of nobility, and so all the nobles want that because it's just a way to show off your wealth. And so you can make quite a bit of money by trapping animals and bringing them back to France. Now this gets us to the concept of mercantilism or mercantilism. So this is an economic theory, and so let's do it by envisioning a circle, a pie. And mercantilism is the idea that all the wealth in the world can be measured. We can gather up all the money, all the land, all the cash crops, all the labor, anything that's worth value, and we can put it inside this pie piece. So the wealth in the world is finite, it's measurable. Right? Now imagine dividing this piece of pie among countries. England has a piece of the pie, France has a piece of the pie, Spain has a big piece of the pie, China has a piece of the pie, so forth and so on. And so if we've seen this pie, it's divided up, that's all the wealth. Mercantilism is the idea that if all the wealth it can be contained in this pie, let's say I'm France. If I go out and get a new colony, I increase my piece of the pie, which means my pie piece gets bigger, which must mean that somebody else's pie piece must get smaller. Imagine that, right? We have a pie piece in this circle, and France just got bigger. They just increased their wealth, which means that somebody else has to lose wealth. And so mercantilism is the idea, it fits right into the European idea of compete or die. That's where they come up with it. That's their mindset. That the reason to have colonies is not only if you get a colony, will it make you wealthier, but it'll make your enemy weaker. And you don't even have to fire a single shot. Just by getting wealthier, you make your enemy weaker. And so this is a major idea you want to understand, driving European exploration and colonization. They believe in mercantilism. If I get wealthier and I get colonies, my enemy, England, France, Spain, whatever, gets weaker. And so this is part of national rivalries. In fact, that's exactly how AP terms it. AP calls it national rivalries. And so you need to understand that these European countries are going to fight wars against each other for colonies and controlling trade routes. And it's all tied up in the concept of mercantilism. All right. Next, Russia. And so Russia is a country that is landlocked. It does have coastline, but it's ice. Russia's really far north. It's far north as most of Canada, or even farther north than some parts of Canada. And so the Russians, if you remember at the end of period 3, the Russians created their country because the Mongols helped them create their country by accident. And so the Russians kicked the Mongols out, and so they have their own country, but it's Europe. So the Russians know we have to get colonies, we have to expand, it's compete or die. But the Russians can't send out explorers. They can't send out ships because they're landlocked. It's cold. And so what do the Russians have to do? The Russians will expand east. So the Russians, unlike everybody else, is going to create a contiguous, which means connected, land-based empire before anybody else. And they're going to go east, from west to east. That's how they're going to get to Asia. That's how they're going to get to China, overland. And as they march east, of course, they're going to discover people who live in Siberia. We call these people Inuits or Eskimos. They are people who live, if you want to think of them, in igloos and ice houses when they need to, if in a stretch. And so they're going to run into these people, and these people have no wealth, but what they do have is there's lots of animals up there. There's lots of beaver and deer and bears and wolves. And so just like the French and the Russians will use native people to go collect those raw materials, in this case animal skins and pelts, for them. And we see that the French and the Russians use this method of using natives to go get this for them. We'll talk more about this later, but this means that Russia, all of their wealth is coming from the east, and so the Russians, it's kind of in this weird zone. They're part of Europe, but they're also part of Asia, and so the Russians are going to be, for period 4, they're for the most part going to be looking east to find wealth, which means they're always going to lag behind the rest of Europe. While the rest of Europe goes through the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and things we'll talk about in the future, new technology, the Russians will always be kind of a time period behind, because they're not connected to the rest of Europe. I mean, sure, they are by land, but there's so much land between them and the rest of Europe that they're isolated. They're also isolated because there's no water route. It's locked up with ice. And so the Russians, they're sort of Asian, they're sort of European, they're kind of in this transition zone. All right, we're getting towards the end, thank goodness. So the Columbian Exchange. So with all of this transition between Europe and the New World, and between Africa and the New World. We get this thing called the Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus. And this is a major thing. Make sure you put a star by it in your notes. So we see there's going to be a transfer, a cultural diffusion of goods and ideas and religions going back and forth across the Atlantic. So from Europe and the Eastern Hemisphere, we're going to get diseases like smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, smallpox. And the Europeans and the Africans have been exposed to that. They built up some resistance. And these explorers, these conquerors, are going to bring that disease with them by accident across the Atlantic. And for the first time, Native Americans are going to be exposed to these diseases, and it's going to wipe them out. They have no resistance to this. Also, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, all kinds of new animals are going to come to the New World, changing the environment, changing how Native Americans, what they eat. We're also going to see new crops like bananas and sugarcane and fruit, citrus fruit, come to the New World. The other way, we're going to see American crops go to Europe, specifically corn and tomatoes and potatoes. Those are the three big ones. And those are American crops that are going to make their way to Europe. And because of this, the European population in period 4 is going to skyrocket. It's going to go up immediately, which is going to cause problems for Europe, as we will see. And so it kind of looks like the Americans get the bad end of this Columbian Exchange. They get diseases, a few new pieces of food and livestock, and the Europeans get a whole bunch of food. Very few diseases come from the Americas into Europe. So impact on demography. I've kind of alluded to this before, but here we see in the top right-hand picture what is a consequence of this Columbian Exchange. Well, Native Americans are going to die off in huge numbers. In some areas, as much as 98% of the Native American population is going to die off in just a few years. So we see this in the graph on the bottom right. We see about 1492, 1500, when we make this contact, the Native American population is going to drastically decrease. Then if we can continue this chart a little bit further out to the right, it's going to slowly start to rise again, because the people who did die from the disease, they're the ones who didn't have any immunity. The few people that survive, they will pass their immunity on to their children, and so the diseases won't have such of an impact. Another reason Native Americans' numbers are going to rebound is because they're being introduced to new food. So they have a richer diet, new animals, pigs, sheep, chickens, and so they're going to have more protein in their diet. So long term, the Native American population is going to start to rise somewhat. Another part of the Columbian Exchange is, of course, we're going to see humans cross the Atlantic. Not just Europeans looking to colonize, looking to conquer, but also African Americans. We're going to take millions of African Americans across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and to Brazil to grow sugar. So that is also going to change the demography of the New World, as well as Africa. And of course, European immigration. I told you specifically that English people are going to come to settle and stay. And so the Americas are going to see Africans come to the New World, we're going to see Anglos come to the New World, and we're going to see Native Americans start to die off. World population trend. And so if you look at this map, the world population is going to go dramatically up. Look at this chart. Around 1350, 1340, the world population takes a dive. That's because of the Black Death, the plague at the end of period 3. But then all of a sudden around 1492, 1500, the world population dramatically goes up. That's because of the Columbian Exchange. New crops, new animals are being exposed to the Eastern Hemisphere. All right, last section, thank goodness. Areas not engaging in naval exploration. There are going to be some countries that don't send out explorers, and this is a great compare-contrast essay. If you store that in your data banks to remember that this could be a compare-contrast essay. China is not going to send out explorers. The Ming Dynasty, when they stopped the treasure fleets, they said, look, the rest of the world has nothing we want. We have all the good things, the silk, the porcelain, the spices, and so let the world come to us. There's no need to pay for exploration. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. If you remember, the Spanish sailed to Manila, and at Manila they traded their New World gold and silver that they're digging out of the New World for Chinese silk and porcelain and spices. And so China at this time is going to get very wealthy in period 4. In fact, too wealthy. We'll talk more about that later. And so the Chinese just do not send out explorers. There's no need. So they're not going to be creating colonies around the world. Macau is a port you should know. That's where these goods from Manila are going to enter China. The the Middle Kingdom. We also talked about the Chinese, how they don't think that the rest of the world is just barbaric. The center of everything is China, and so why should we go and conquer these barbaric people? It's not like they're going to help us. They don't have any goods we want, so who needs exploration? They also won't be conquered by Europe at this time. That's period 5. We'll see Europe conquer China, but not in period 4. The Europeans are too small, too weak, too divided, and the Chinese are too big, too powerful, too centralized, too many people, too strong of a centralized government. So as much as the Europeans may want to conquer the Chinese and steal all of their stuff, they certainly won't be able to do it in period 4. Japan. Japan is also not going to send out any explorers because Japan is isolationist. If you remember at the end of period 3, the Japanese are going to go into a period of feudal Japan. They're going to be the shogun period, the shogunate, the Bakufu government, moving around from family to family. They're just going to be too self-obsessed with fighting each other to send out explorers. Now, that doesn't mean that the Europeans aren't going to arrive in Japan. A few Europeans do. And the Japanese have silver, and so the Europeans want that silver to trade with the Chinese for Chinese goods. And so what do the Japanese want? Well, the Japanese want European guns and gunpowder. And so some of the Japanese nobles, remember it's feudal in Japan, some of the Japanese nobles start to trade their silver for European golds and cannons. And so this escalates war in Japan. This threatens even more chaos. And so the shogun of Japan, the chief noble of Japan, he forbids anybody from trading with the rest of the world because it's destabilizing the country. And so he says Japan will even more be isolationist. We are going to just stay stuck in time. We're not going to let you guys have any guns from Europe because it's too destabilizing. And so from now all the way until the 1850s, Japan is going to be stuck in the medieval period. They're going to have castles still, and they're going to have knights and samurais and nobles and no guns, even though the rest of the world is marching forward, because we don't want this destabilization to happen. India. India is, for the same reason as China, is not going to send out explorers. The same reason as Japan. Well, so let's start with Japan. The similarity to Japan, India is decentralized. Now, of course, the northern part of India was the Sultanate of Delhi, which gets replaced with what we will talk about later, the Mughal Empire. But the Mughal Empire, like most empires in India, is decentralized. They let local rajas rule. And so we really don't have a central government that can send out explorers. Plus, just like in China, everybody comes to India. So what's the point in sending out explorers? The Europeans would love to conquer Japan or India. They certainly do conquer some ports in period 4, but they can't conquer India as a country inland because there's just too many Indians and too few Europeans. Plus, there is enough of a centralized government, even though they're kind of decentralized, the Mughals, that the Europeans have no hope of overcoming this big government, this big empire. Russia, we've already talked about, they'll extend east, and so they don't send out explorers because, well, they don't have access to water. And then the very last thing we have is Africa. Does anybody in Africa send out explorers? Well, not really, because most of the people in Africa are kin-based states, so they don't have any large empires. The Swahili city-states on the east coast of Africa, they don't need to send out explorers. They have their trade routes that are profitable in the Indian Ocean, so there's no need to explore. And then in West Africa, the Songhai Empire, which comes after Ghana and Mali, they don't need to send out explorers. They have the Trans-Saharan trade, and then that Trans-Saharan trade goes away because of the Portuguese water route. And so they fall, and so they can't send out explorers because they just cease to exist. And so we really don't see any centralized state in Africa to send out explorers. In addition to that, the Europeans cannot conquer Africa. First of all, because there's too few Europeans, too many Africans, but also Africa, if we were to turn Africa on its side and cut it like a cake, you see this diagram on the bottom left. Africa is a plateau. There's a thin coastline around the coast of Africa, and then the entire continent rises up like someone just pushed up the middle. And so if you were trying to sail a boat into Africa to explore, you could only get a few miles into the coast of Africa, and then you hit the shelf. I mean, you can't go up the waterfall. And so for the rest of period 4, Africa's interior is not going to be conquered, even though the Europeans might want to. In fact, it is known as the Dark Continent because it is unknown, it is dark. Eventually in period 5, the Europeans will come up with ways to explore inland, but not yet. And so Africa becomes this big question mark. Nobody knows really what's inside of Africa, at least nobody from Europe.